Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show's Reading Rangers!
Tomorrow will be kinder, I whisper, as I am swept into the rushing river of my dreams. From The Ark of the Turtle's Back by J. Simpson.
I'm Daniel.
I'm Trish.
And on today's show, we'll be discussing Love After the End, an anthology of Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer speculative fiction that's edited by Joshua Whitehead and published by Arsenal Pulp Press. It's a re-release of a previously published by another publishing company. I believe Arsenal Pulp put it out in 2020, which happens to be the copy that I have, but your copy that you might get might be different.
Okay, but before we get into our discussion of this anthology, we need to remind our listeners to please share your questions and comments with us at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. If you aren't already here, join us on Twitch, on Sean's Alphabet Streams channel, Fridays at 7 Central, to be a part of our interactive live streaming format. Please tell folks about this show and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth is a big deal for fan-run podcasts, and we need your help to find new ears for this ridiculous show. And speaking of finding new ears, if you can, please share on social media. I'm sure that Sean, Alphabet Streams, or Skiffy and Fanty is doing something about how we're going live now on this discussion, so if he will post on social media, if y'all can repost that would be super. Thanks. So now, let's get to it. Daniel, tell us you've told us a little bit about Love After the End, but how did this anthology come to us to do now?
Well, it came to my attention, at least, when I did an interview with Wabgishig Rice to coincide with the release of his novel, Moon of the Turning Leaves. And so I'd done an interview with him for the Skiffy and Fanty blog. Hopefully people had seen that. And that book, Moon of the Turning Leaves, was a sequel to Moon of the Crusted Snow. Both highly recommended if you have not had the chance to read them. But talking to Wabgishig, one of the questions I asked in the interview was where fans of speculative fiction might go to read more from indigenous writers of speculative fiction. And he, particularly, I said things that might not necessarily be on the radar of every, common speculative fiction fan. And he had mentioned this book, Love After the End, as well as one other one, as being ones that would be worth looking into. And so I decided at that point that it would be maybe a good idea for us to do that, to cover it here. And so the other text, which I'm blanking on the name of it now, but you can find it in that interview that I did with him, it is now out of print. And so it would be much more difficult for us to have the discussion with, to coordinate everything. And so maybe we'll still be able to get to that one in the future. But this one, as I mentioned, has a relatively newly released edition from Arsenal Pulp Press that you're able to still get that's in print. And so, yeah, as I mentioned in that intro and Trish mentioned, it's edited by Joshua Whitehead. And specifically, it's an anthology that's geared toward Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer writers. And so Joshua Whitehead, in his introduction, talks a lot about those concepts. I don't know how much time we'll have to talk about them, but what I found interesting, not surprisingly, I guess, is that concept of Two-Spirit can vary highly depending on what specific indigenous culture you're talking about. And so each individual, unique culture of indigenous people sort of have their own terminology for what kind of globally encompassingly has been termed two-spirit, or Joshua Whitehead, I believe he is the one who coined that term, Indigiqueer, their own words for it and their own concepts of what exactly that means, or even the degrees to which it has been historically an accepted kind of gender or position within that particular culture. And in the introduction, Joshua Whitehead also speaks a bit about how sometimes the term gets appropriated by white people, by the LGBTQIA, depending how many letters you want to put onto that acronym, get applied to them. And really, it's not a one-to-one sort of like indigenous equivalent to LGBTQIA, which is why Whitehead kind of, one of the reasons at least, Whitehead kind of took this term Indigiqueer, because 2SQ, as you'd abbreviate it in the acronym to set it apart, it is not just that matter of gender identity, it's also enwrapped in it the cultural indigenous aspects of what that sets them apart from white settler people, or even people of other, quote, races. And so that introduction is a really good place. I'm not probably adequately summarizing those concepts, but that's a good place to turn to kind of get his definition and his discussion of what that all means. And so this collection focuses on those writers, but it had been kind of pitched, as the title suggests, Love After the End, as being sort of a post-apocalyptic type thing. A dystopia, as most often would be associated with that term post-apocalyptic in pop culture. But as we'll talk about a little later, a lot of the stories actually end up gearing a little more towards the utopia side of things. And partially that's because I think it's relatively widely discussed that for indigenous people, they're already living in the apocalypse. Like, the apocalypse is not something that's going to come. They're already in that apocalypse or even post-apocalyptic type environment. And so they were looking, the stories kind of naturally kind of became, I guess, more positive outlooks of an indigenous futurism, if you will. And so I don't know if you want to add any other thoughts to that, to those ideas, Trish, before we dive into stories.
I'll just add that although these are all more or less post-apocalyptic and therefore have some science fiction elements, many of these stories also, the two spirits have special connections with the natural world and the spirit world. And so this is... I would say, another word for this collection would be science fantasy, although that's a bit judgmental, I suppose. But there are elements of spiritual or magical ties in several of these stories, even if it's just to dreaming, but there are other things where there are more more elements that can happen.
Right. And there's a lot of ecological focus that kind of comes up again and again, and not at all of them. And even that title, Love, a lot of the stories deal with love, but I don't think it's something that universally the collection necessarily is dealing with.
Well, it's certainly not all romantic love.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. So probably we may as well get on to some specifics now and talk about individual stories. And we may just as well go chronologically through the collection as it's set up in the book. And
there's a total of 9 stories, right? If I remember.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yes, sorry. Yeah, it's a fairly short collection. I think it's like 180 pages or something like that. But it's better if you can spread out the reading, over several days instead of just trying to swallow all these stories in one sitting, because then you might mix up some parts of them.
Definitely.
It would be hard to mix up the first story with any of the others, though. The first story is called Abacus by Nathan Adler, and this is about an augmented AI rat who is living on Jupiter's moon Io, who has hacked his code and is trying to escape. And he also has a friend that he wants to take with him, who is an Anishinaabe teenager. I please forgive me if I get that pronunciation wrong. But it is sweet. It is it's about making connections with people or entities who are different from you, and it was fun to read. I didn't feel it particularly meshed well with the rest of the book. It's not terribly post-apocalyptic, unless the apocalypse was far in the past. I mean, here they are colonizing or farming on moons of the outer solar system. So, but I enjoyed it a lot. What did you think about it, Daniel?
I agree with what you're saying. I think the vibes of the story are more distant from a lot of the other stories in the collection, for the reasons that you mentioned. The focus really, I guess in some ways what makes it unique is that there's a much more direct romantic love type connection going on here between the characters. But I think it works fine because it's the first story in the collection. Mm-hmm. And so, even though it sets itself apart in some regards, it works there for just dipping into the collection. And sure. It does share with others in terms of having aspects of it that are sort of grim and more pessimistic, but meeting those with a ending that rides on optimism and hope. A lot of the stories, even though they have dark aspects to them, will end or have overall those feelings of hope, and this one does as well. Because the main sort of theme of it is that people don't approve of humans having relationships with AI. They think it's deviant, disgusting, dirty. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways it's sort of like a stand-in for other types of human-human relationships that might be frowned upon by some societies, both past and present. But now putting it into a more broader identities of personhood. Mm-hmm. The only other thing... Sorry. Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
The story specifically mentions that disapproval of male-male relationships is far in the past. But unfortunately, humans have tendencies to make categories and put those categories in classes where some are good and some are, not good. And so the discrimination against AI personalities with biological humans, I guess, is a future prejudice that one can expect.
Right. And it definitely won me over with its sweetness. I kind of read it with an antagonistic bent at the start, just from the aspect of when I see the word AI now, I become very negative and angry. And so when I saw it, in some ways, I wasn't angry and upset about the relationship. I was angry and upset just simply because of AI for reasons present. But the sweetness of the relationship and the humanity of the characters really shone through. And I like that positive light. So I thought it was a great start to things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that certainly the AI is now a rather tainted term, I think, certainly in this story, since Abacus has free will. One could certainly count that as being a person of a sort, but
correct. Yeah, it's certainly much more than they
Abacus
put
is
AI.
not a large language model.
No.
But yeah, that's a thing that is science fiction writers are going to have to deal with, because a lot of characters that they've been calling AIs, from Adrian Tchaikovsky to Cat Rambo or whoever, all those people who are having AI characters. I think that's going to be kind of a reaction. We many of us who have thought about this attitude now come in with a visceral anger reflex.
Yes.
To reading the term AI.
The term has been misappropriated, right?
Yeah, it has. Because truly what they are selling as AI is just plagiarism algorithms. Anyway, for now, we just have to distinguish from context what we're looking at in a story.
So yeah, the next story then after that is History of the New World by Adam Garnett Jones. And this is one of the first ones where you get sort of an ecological perspective and you get that concept of end of the world. What you have is that Earth is effectively devastated and being destroyed by climate change and other political realities and issues that we can well imagine. However, a parallel Earth has been discovered. So this is one where, and there's another story that's coming up that also involves leaving Earth, but here it's leaving Earth for another parallel universe Earth. But there's some question to whether that other parallel universe Earth is inhabited by, quote, intelligent life or not. And what we have in the story is a indigenous woman and her white spouse, her white wife, and the daughter of the indigenous woman are considering leaving Earth to go to this parallel Earth. And while the wife is eager to go, the indigenous woman has her doubts on whether it's a good thing to go or not.
Right. Yeah, there's quite a lot in this story, quite a lot of conflict and dialogue where you have the opposing views of should we stay or should we go? Are you being a realist, or are you, trying to just deny what's happening? Or are you trying to deny the problems inherent in wanting to escape? So they're each, accusing the other of not really looking at things how they are. M seems a bit conflict averse, but then again, Thor arguing with Thora doesn't seem to do a lot of good either.
And there's argument, too, over the question of what is colonialism.
Yes.
And is this then just another form of colonialism? And not surprisingly, someone that's indigenous might have a problem, and that might be a moral consideration that's really coming to the fore of them, of if they want to go. Right. What effect is that going to have on the life that's there already as you colonize this new world? Mm-hmm. So I found that really interesting about the story. It was one of my favorites in the collection.
Yeah, it's interesting, the optimism of Thora, the white wife, who is convinced that things will simply work out because they always do, as far as she's concerned. They always, have found solutions at the last minute, and of course things will be okay over there too. And, confidently make some assertions about things working out, and M, the two-spirit wife, just has to look at her. And she flinches, realizing, Thora is being a bit too cavalier. So I think I think it was a really well-written story at showing these conflicts between them and, giving each of them a little space, although there's definitely a viewpoint of, with the resolution, that,
who's right
whose
here?
side you're supposed to be on
Right.
as the story resolves. Exactly. But I thought it was a good one. I enjoyed it. It was interesting.
Yep. And so that brings us then to the next story that also deals with leaving Earth, The Ark of the Turtle's Back by Jay Simpson, that you quoted from as the tagline to start this episode. So what were your... I guess you could quick summarize that,
Sure.
Trish, and give your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, the Earth is doing really badly. They have made settlements on the Moon and on Mars, but they're not popular, and they are constantly coming through with heavy-duty pressure to join these settlements, and also just flat out drafting people, and especially drafting people from disadvantaged populations, like people on reservations, indigenous populations, and so
Effectively putting them into forced labor, in a way.
Exactly, right. Which unfortunately has a huge amount of historical precedent. And anyway, so there's a family, there's a sister who's been in the city and comes back with a lover and a secret, and tells everybody that they have to pack up fast, and she won't tell them where they're going. It then turns out that what they're doing and where they're going is going to be very dangerous, both for those on the trip and those left behind. I'm not sure. I don't want to give away the whole plot, but there are certainly choices that have to be made.
Mm-hmm. And this is one of the more difficult stories of the collection, I think. There's a lot going on in it. Because there's the level of the plot, there's a huge moral question there that they're leaving Earth involves questionable moral decisions and huge impacts on those that would be still on Earth. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, when one looks at it compared to history of colonization and history of leaving an area and coming to a new one, it's symbolically, and it makes sense, and it's interesting, but people could read it and be offended or upset by it, I could say. But then the story is much more than that, because there's also a level of it that's that I personally didn't connect with, because I'm not female, and I'm not a mother. But motherhood and the idea of being able to become pregnant and having children and continuing the generations is a huge subtext or a huge part of the story as well. So there's just a lot going on in the story that is interesting, I think, but at the same time, it makes it hard to delve into.
Yeah, and not wanting to say the resolution does make it slightly difficult to discuss the moral choices, but sacrifices are having to be made, and you don't always get to choose whether you're the sacrificer or the sacrificee. I did have a logical problem with this story in that, I'm not talking about fantasy elements, but more that a huge number of people have been working on a project in secret, and I just I just have trouble believing that could have happened, given the oppression that these people are under already. But that's a small part of the plot here.
Right.
So
it makes sense. Yeah. Your comment or your concern with that makes perfect sense to me as well. I just didn't even think about it when I was reading the story, but yeah, it's totally fair, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. The next story I liked quite a lot. How to Survive the Apocalypse for Native Girls by K. Minoche Pyle. And this is in the form of diary or journal entries. A girl is writing notes for, descendants or people she might run into later or whatever, basically not just survival tips, but life tips. How to deal with the people in your lives and what is important to remember and how to deal with other people. I liked it a lot, but I'd say the biggest theme of this story is who gets to be kin, who gets to be your people, because a central conflict in this story is that after the apocalypse, this group of indigenous people have formed a collective that are surviving together, and there is a council that gets to decide whether you count as one of the group or not. Are you kinfolk or are you a stranger who can be exiled? The girl, protagonist here, who is Two-Spirit, does not, is not directly under threat themselves, but they see how their best friend, because of the kindness that their mother is showing, and also as a medical professional has been taught to treat everyone equally, that puts the friend in danger, and then our protagonist, Nigig, has to decide, is she going to stand with these people or leave with these people, or what is she going to do? And I really enjoyed the tone of voice and the decisions that were made.
Yeah, I agree. This was one I enjoyed a lot. It's an example of a short story, to me at least, an example of a short story where the format of it as these, point-by-point guides of how to survive the apocalypse, but also just how to live life and how to respect others, is at times witty and whimsical, very joyful, but then also underlying it all is these really serious themes about and conflicts over kinship. And so it's just a wonderful marriage in the structure and tone that the story kind of takes. Mm-hmm. And I also really found the theme personally interesting to me, because one of the things as I'm reading a collection like this that I'm trying to be aware of is to not romanticize or fetishize or as exoticize the other, and not to see indigenous cultures as being something that are perfect or that are something that are a complete replacement for anything. And yeah, again, perfect. There's issues. They're human. Whatever person you're talking about, that personhood has negative aspects to it. The culture has both good things and things that could be problematic. And here, this conflict that arises over kinship was just a reminder that to me, it really nicely set a story where you're not just taking ideals of a culture and making it into a utopia. You're acknowledging that even when some good can be done and there are good aspects to something, there are still potentials for this to be taken in bad ways. And I found that interesting here, particularly by being able to make this a short story that had that component, but still was overall very positive feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. Right. The next story. I don't know if is there an audiobook of this, Daniel? Because I was just reading.
That is a good question. Maybe Sean can look that up.
Yeah, I don't know.
In the question as well.
But sadly, we're just going to have to stumble over some of these pronunciations and ask people in advance to forgive us.
Well, this one we have it's spelled out in the sort of postscript that the book has. And so it's an Algonquin term, I believe, Undwanekajingun. That's my best, based on how it's sort of phonetically spelled out. And so it's a term, quote, a record, to set down or record, to set down in writing or the like, as for the purpose of preserving evidence. And so that's a short story by Gabriel Castillo Calderon.
Right. In this story, we have a member of the people who call themselves by that phrase, the Rememberers, and these people, when a story is told, these special people have marks or symbols appear on their skin, little red marks like tattoos, when they're told the story, and then they can repeat that story back without losing anything. Even a whole book like 1984, or there are various other stories that are referenced. Let's see. Enforcers kidnap the protagonist and kill her lover and take her to a camp. And being who she is, she starts to tell stories to the other people in the camp. And start to memorize those stories. I don't want to spoil what else happens in the story, but basically, she finds a new way to pass on her traditions and ends up feeling like she is not the last of her people anymore, because she is passing on, sharing her identity, or her what makes her special with the new people that she's found.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like this story. This awesome image of this coming of age sort of ritual or experience where you become a storyteller, where the words, appear on, or the symbols appear on your skin, and then you touch them, and when you touch them, that immediately evokes and brings back that entire story for you to tell. It really it gives sort of magical realism kind of spin on traditional oral traditions, right, of passing on stories through the ages, and the power that words have in society and culture. And I mean, for people that love to read, you can't get more excited than something like that, of that concept of the power of telling stories and the power of words over life and relationships. And so I love that about this story.
Sure. Obviously there's a shade of Fahrenheit 451 with people memorizing books and things. I was also thinking of in Roots, by Alex Haley. I haven't actually read the book, but watched the miniseries back then. When Alex Haley goes to Africa trying to, connect with his roots, he encounters a rememberer for a tribe in Africa, and that person's job basically is to remember the genealogies of the people in the tribe, going back generations and generations and generations and generations, and just memorizing, keeping it in memory. And, it's a special way that, he can't just randomly search in a memory and find out a fact. But if you tell him, tell me the lineage of this person, he'll go back, 10, however many, 15, 20 maybe generations, and just recite everything. So great feats of memorization are indeed possible. So that part of the story is plausible, but of course there are also magical elements in the story. The spirits get involved in this and help our protagonist. But here again, this is a story that starts out pretty horribly, pretty dystopically, and yet people manage to make connections and move toward a more positive world. So it is, in the end, an optimistic story.
Right. And so that brings us then to Story for Our Bottle by Darcy Little Badger. And for listeners and speculative fiction fans, that's probably the name in here that you, if anyone, you probably have heard before or read works by before. At least for me, it was the one I most well knew. So in this story, it's another one that, to me at least, I don't know how you feel, Trish, but for me, it didn't necessarily fit completely with the others in terms of the plot or some of the themes of it. It did in terms of the darkness followed by optimism, though. And so it involves a girl who is kidnapped from her home with her family and twin brother, if I remember correctly. No, not twin, but brother, that she almost considers like a twin, if I remember correctly. But she's kidnapped, and she's kidnapped onto this sort of floating island that is the remnant of like a white person enclave that was made in the ocean to when apocalypse did happen. But nobody seems to have really survived on this island. And so she thinks she has been effectively kidnapped by the AI or by an artificial intelligence that still exists on this island. But whether that is the case or not remains for the reader to see.
Mm-hmm. Right. One of the most striking things in this story to me was the way that the AI, Olivia, kept insisting that our protagonist, who names herself Mona Lisa because she refuses to give her name and the power of her name to this kidnapper, Olivia keeps insisting that it has rescued Mona Lisa.
Right. Yes.
And that they are much, much better off, working as, enforced laborer, maintaining machines and things on this ship than our protagonist had been with her family, with the people who love her. And this is not such a hardscrabble existence that they can't take off a day at the beach to celebrate somebody's birthday. So, obviously, Olivia is very wrong, but also, there are, this is a thing that has happened again and again to indigenous people. I'm thinking of the schools that people were kidnapped to, taken away from their families until they couldn't learn. couldn't remember their language anymore, forced haircuts, forced clothes, punished severely if they did try to speak their own language, and all in the name of civilizing these quote-unquote savage children, and done with ostensibly good intentions, but wrecking civilizations and cultures.
Right.
That has been very difficult to recover from. So yeah, just the arrogance of Olivia is a reflection of that whole mindset. And I thought it was a pretty striking story. And I appreciated that Mona Lisa does not give in. She makes plans and takes actions. And the story ends with hope. We don't quite have a positive resolution because we're not quite sure how things are going to turn out. But there are signs that our protagonist will make it home in the end.
Right.
Yeah, so I liked the story a lot. I thought it was, impactful and said some important things. Yeah.
Okay. So then that brings us to Seed Children by Mari Kurisato. And this is, if there were a paired story, or if our first story that we talked about, Abacus, had another partner within this collection, Seed Children might be it, in the sense that it is another one that deals with artificial intelligence, constructed beings. And so this is another one where Earth is ending and civilizations are leaving Earth, true, at least human civilizations, and leaving Earth to go to other homes, potentially. And so they're sending out seed ships, effectively, but not included in that are constructed beings that are not considered to be persons and not worthy of being able to effectively be allowed to leave. And so one of the protagonists of this story is, I forget which group it's from, if it's Ojibwe or Anishinaabe, but indigenous person, their consciousness has been effectively uploaded into an artificial life form, and wants to leave and bring children artificial life forms as well. But there's resistance from those in power to allowing this to happen because they are considered less than human. So it's another story that, again, it's a futuristic parallel of historical situations and historical outlooks on native populations as not being human enough for rights. And, the idea of soldiers going in to slaughter them because they were quote-unquote savages and not worthy of the same considerations as you consider for someone else. So again, it's a really grim story, but again, without giving away the end, it ends with utter brightness and hope and positivity. After a bit of an action sequence.
Right.
Probably the biggest action sequence in the entire collection, actually, now that I think about it.
I guess the largest scale battle,
yeah,
maybe?
Battle, yeah.
I had thought that actually the synthetic protagonist was helping human children, actually. But
I completely missed that then.
Well, I could have misread it too. But the point is that, these are not these are not our protagonist's children, but our protagonist chooses to help these children survive, and this is going to end up with, you know, more of a population, maybe in a precarious station with where they end up, but they're all working together and they all see each other as people, and yeah, so it is another, certainly a positive story and a positive ending for this one.
And I like there's imagery in there, or symbolism of a tree appearing in it a lot. The idea of seeds and roots and trees that come in play that I really enjoyed in the story.
Mm-hmm. Right. Working with nature.
Right. That really connected it to that ecological side of things.
Right, yes. Well, the next story also has to do with people trying to save people. Nameless by Nazba Tom. The viewpoint in this switches between Jennifer, a caseworker, a parole supervisor or something who drinks herself to sleep every night, and K, who is a Navajo student of someone who had survived the near extinction of the last World War, and this mentor is teaching them how to dream, or teaching them how to they are
how to travel
true dreams, and the mentor is teaching them how to do that more effectively. And so the story is switching viewpoints and jumping back and forth in time, and the dreams are doing a sort of time travel as well. And I thought it was pretty interesting. There's not a huge amount of conflict in this story. It's more about learning how to, learning how to trust, and how to make the most of your gifts. Again, a pretty positive story.
How to open up.
Yeah, how to open up.
And, yeah.
Right. So that was, like I said, not so much conflict in this story, but there can be a lot of conflict just in allowing yourself to believe and open up. And
right. It was internal conflicts of
internal. Yeah.
It was because each character in a way was living a life of fear of something.
Yes.
Right. And so it's like learning to some way to overcome those fears that are inherent in them, or whatever it is that's holding them back, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, I enjoyed this story a lot in terms of that, and the again, magical realism kind of take on traveling and communicating with your ancestors. I found that really interesting, and I liked it. But I wish there had been more in terms of Jennifer's past, and everything became focused on saving Jennifer in a way. But then there's still all those others of the DNA that Jennifer's trying to help in a system that doesn't really want to help them. I mean, one of the points, I guess, is Jennifer's this caseworker, but she's overwhelmed by just how powerless she is and how difficult it is to get the system to care about these individuals, right? And so I was hoping there'd be a little more about not just a warning to Jennifer, but also then us being able to see what Jennifer does with that, other than just fleeing the apocalypse that is to come, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm assuming that this is not the only dream that A will have, and that they will be reaching out and saving other people, hopefully, as well. Right. As you said, Jennifer struggles with not having much power And we don't actually see, Jennifer packing up and leaving. We don't know if she brought others with her on the way or,
and we don't know what comes of Ka either after this, all what they do. So I guess in some ways it's not a criticism of the story. It's just like, I'm really curious to know more about this world and these characters, right?
Sure. And it's not like this story ends without resolution, because there are decision points that are shown, and things that are done that end up working. It's not unsatisfying in its. There are still questions to be answered, but I still found it a pretty satisfying story despite that.
All right, so that brings us then to our last story, Eloise, by David A. Robertson. And speaking of bigger stories, this is actually the sequel to another story that Robertson wrote for another anthology that features the same characters. And so it can be read on its own, but I read a summary of that previous story, and it helped me kind of grasp what the heck was going on in this story a little more, from just a one kind of cursory read, I guess, to be able to discuss it. So I think knowing the previous story definitely enhances things, but the main plot points of that first story do get covered in Eloise. And so this is a story of, again, a near future, I guess you would say, where people are able to immerse themselves in a virtual reality world where time goes more quickly within that. So if you spend, I forget what the actual ratio is, but like 10 minutes in real life is effectively like 100 years in this virtual life. And so people can use this virtual world to explore possibilities of things that they want to know about. And sort of play out scenarios. And what happened in the previous story is that two girls met in a cafe and happened to be attracted to each other, but one of them is a little hesitant to actually take the step of calling them up on their phone and asking them out and trying to date. And so she uses this program to do the what if. What would our life be like if maybe we did this? And so from that experience, things don't necessarily go the way she had planned or hoped. This story is the fallout from that, the continuation where the one that never really got contacted from her, that is still interested, is starting to investigate, well, what did she do? Why did she not contact me? And trying to find out more because she can't keep her out of her thoughts and can't keep her out of her dreams.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one that is definitely within that love side to the title of the story and has conflict, but doesn't go with the other stories in terms of really apocalypse per se.
Right.
At least not in the popular sense, and not with ecology or anything like. So it's somewhat of a standalone. One thing, just made me think of it, Nameless, one of the things of that previous story we just talked about I really loved, is that it is so apocalyptic in the actual literal original sense of that term of a revelation. And so I love that story and that it dealt with apocalypse in multiple ways. But anyway, back to Eloise. This is almost like a personal apocalypse on the relationship level, which I did find interesting.
Mm-hmm. There's a bit of a social, maybe apocalypse is too dramatic, but there are certainly huge social changes going on.
Right.
She goes...
And social commentary.
Yeah, our protagonist goes into... Cassie goes into a cafe, and an internet cafe, and half the people there are zoned out wearing patches connected to computers and inside their virtual heads. And so huge changes are happening socially, and there are ads all over the place for this GATE program.
And a mother is forcing her young boy to do it.
Mm-hmm. Right,
so then,
and his personality is changed after he undergoes the procedure.
Right.
Yeah, it's there's definitely some massive social changes going on in that story, but the world isn't wrecked or anything. But society is definitely changing. But you're right that it doesn't quite fit the anthology in that way, but it's there are massive social changes going on and people making choices about, how they're going to relate to each other and to society. There are certainly lots and lots of stories about people sinking into virtual reality and preferring it over their real lives. This is a little different in that it's more about letting people explore their choices. But it certainly echoes with a lot of other stories. Mm-hmm. But I enjoyed it. And
ends optimistically.
And again. Ends optimistically. Yeah. Let's see. So, let's see. That's all the stories. That's all the individual stories, but we want to talk about it more as a group.
Yeah, we have a few minutes where we can kind of talk about overarching or last thoughts. Particularly, we've mentioned now again, this sort of ending optimistically.
Right. Yeah. And we were talking at the beginning of this about how, quote, post-apocalyptic fiction hits differently for American indigenous people because their people have already been undergoing apocalypses for centuries. If I recall my history of Latin America, about 90% of Central America, anyway, the population died from disease. Plague swept them after the Spanish explorers conquistadors started their operations. I've certainly read stories from the viewpoint of course, they're going to survive apocalyptic conditions better because they've already been having to survive that. But yeah, I think it was referred to as the Great Dying or something, and lots of inhabitants thought that the world was coming to an end then, and it just keeps, terrible things have happened, obviously. Mm-hmm. But if you just give in to despair, then it's going to be a lot harder to survive. And so hope is very, very important. And, even if it's just the hope of surviving for another day, another week, sometimes that's all you can do. But then a lot of these stories are also about building communities and building toward the future. And so, yeah, it does end, these are set in apocalypses, but they are very positive nonetheless. Yeah,
they're queered towards the utopian, mm-hmm. as Whitehead, I think, phrases it kind of in the intro.
In the intro, yeah.
Right. And the intro for the new edition, at least from 2020, also then refers to the pandemic we just went through and effects that has on populations, and talking about, as Trish mentioned, how disease has affected indigenous populations through colonialization in the past too, and that this period has sort of been a reminder to them of that. and influence things. And so, yeah, all those connections I found interesting.
Mm-hmm. We should also mention that, utopias are often portrayed as universal, but in fact, tastes and desires differ. One person's utopia may be another person's dystopia. And in fact, dystopias can be utopias for some people. For instance... I was watching the Last of Us episode for the Hugo Awards, in which there's a survivalist who, once all the people leave town, being taken off by the government to a camp somewhere, and he hid from them, he's left on his own, and he's absolutely ecstatic because now he gets to, build his little fortress and take. So anyway, someone's dystopia can be another person's utopia, if that gives you a chance toward more freedom, but more risk. And then again, there are many supposed utopias that turn out to have flies in the ointment and secretly dystopias. So I just
yeah, Prince Justice says every dystopia is a utopia for someone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, do you have any thoughts on, well, actually, one thing I was wondering about was, if you're arguing about what kind of utopia you want to build, does any kind of compromise taint a utopia, or can making compromises be part of the utopian society you're trying to build?
Right. I don't know if you're asking me personally.
Oh, I'm kind of asking the air. I'm thinking out loud.
Okay. Okay. One of the novels I've read that is... I haven't read that much utopian fiction. It's more rare, of course, than dystopian. But one that I will point out that maybe not everyone has heard of is Still Forms on Foxfield from 1980 by Joan Slonczewski. Most of her novels feature microbiology, which is why she's been of interest to me. She's also the author of the textbook I use for my course. But Still Forms on Foxfield was her debut novel, and it is effectively about a utopia, a Quaker utopia, and she is Quaker herself. And that utopia is not without conflict. That utopia is not without threats. And one of the things that I think works so well in it is a believable utopia, at least when I read it for me, that is built from those compromises by still remaining something that everybody can buy into, and still be open. But a hard thing to do, which is why there's a lot less out there of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And even this, I mean, it gears towards the utopian, but they all have a grimness, really, as well. You could still say it's a grim collection. And that utopia, it's kind of there at the end as hope, but it's just you're choosing to end the story at a high point, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily certain that there's going to be continued at that state, but but the point of it is not to... The point of it is to imagine it, right? To imagine where that's possible.
Mm-hmm. Right, and imagine... there are individual individual survivors here, but I believe all of the stories have someone, even if they're on their own, they're working to get back with other people or to help other people, to build communities with other people. And so very much surviving in these stories, surviving an apocalypse involves finding your community and helping to build it. And I think that's something that all of us can take to heart.
Right. Which is also what Wobisha Rice's books are about, too, the duology that I mentioned at the beginning. That brought me to reading this. It's very much about that finding community as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we should end, but the one other thing I did want to point out as kind of a wrap-up is that I've seen this anthology being described as YA a lot as well. I don't know if that was officially ever, in its original publication, maybe part of the marketing for it, or part of the description for it. I can somewhat see it in that many of the protagonists maybe are YA.
But then again, some of the protagonists are middle-aged with children.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know as I agree with that at all, but it was definitely out there, like, as I was sort of reading up on things.
Well, I would say that definitely YA is not the only market that can appreciate this book.
Correct.
Mature readers can get a lot from it as well.
But YA certainly could as well, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I should also mention, I was able to find this story on Hoopla, so which is a library service, an online library service. So people who are interested can try and see if they can check it out there. Or of course, we'll put some links in the show notes for where people can go if they want to actually try to buy it.
All right, so that's it, folks. If you'd like to let us know what you thought about this episode or other past ones, head on over to skiffyandfancy.com/listener suggestions. And as mentioned before, please, you can follow us at Skiffy and Fancy on most social media sites, all of which can be found at our link tree, linktr.ee/skiffyandfancy. There you can also find links to be able to subscribe to our newsletter. And as we mentioned before, please consider supporting us at Patreon. It only takes $1 a month to support us and be a part of our craziness. So please do that if you are able and so inclined. And in general, just spread the word about a podcast that we hope you love and enjoy.
All right. Leave some reviews if you can. That would also be appreciated. Anyway, you can find me, Trish, on Blue Sky at P.E. Matson, on Mastodon at newsy.social/@TrishEM, and on my blog at whatsthewordnow.blogspot.com, and I also write reviews occasionally on Skiffy and Fancy.
You write a lot of reviews on Skiffy and Fanny.
Sporadically.
You can find me, Daniel, on Blue Sky at Reading 1000 Lives, and 1000 is the numerals, not spelled out. You can read my reviews on skiffyandfancy.blog, on reading1000lives.com, and other outlets as well. And so nothing's left, I guess, than to make this an awkward ending. So may the microbes be with you.
And take care of yourselves and each other.